Hi, listeners. It's hard to believe, but New Frontiers in Functional Medicine has been going strong since 2015. With over 200 episodes and over 2 million listens, we are growing every year. My goal is to continue to bring you the best minds in functional medicine, epigenetics, and longevity. I want the content to be actionable for the functional medicine clinician and interesting for the rest of us. Thank you for supporting this podcast with your likes, with your honest reviews, with sharing the episodes with your friends and family. And if you haven't done so, please consider leaving a like or leaving us an honest review wherever you've accessed this podcast. Thank you, thank you, thank you to our sponsors. Because of our sponsors, these are companies that I trust, that we vet carefully, that we use in clinical practice, that I use personally. Because of them, everything associated with this podcast is free. If you haven't done so, I suggest you head over to drkarafitzgerald.com to the podcast page where you can access the full transcript for every single one of these 200 episodes. And along with that transcript, you'll get an episode summary. You can get the research citations and additional content that is pertinent to the episode. I myself return to the transcript page all the time to pull out a little snippet of information that I want to recall or access a citation. Or better yet, sign up for our newsletter, again, at drkarafitzgerald.com, and every single podcast episode will drop in your email as soon as it's released. Thanks again. Hi, everybody. Welcome to New Frontiers in Functional Medicine, where we are interviewing the best minds in functional medicine. And of course, today is no exception. If you're here with us on YouTube, you can see I am sitting next to the amazing Ashley Koff. We are going to talk about all things specialized pro-resolving lipid mediators today. And we're going to be really digging in deeply on the clinical application of said extraordinary molecules. Let me give you her background. I'll give you an awesome discount code, and then we're going to dive right in. Ashley Koff, IRD, is a 25-plus year award-winning practitioner developing and providing truly personalized solutions for patients, practitioners, and organizations. Today, she helms a team at the Better Nutrition Program, a company she founded in 2019, and is a fractional chief nutrition officer for entities like VitaBoom. I also want to throw in there that she's connected with us in our training programs. Ashley, I know our connection goes back years, and it's always really nice to be with you and kind of mine your brilliance and your inspiration. So welcome to New Frontiers.
Thank you. And I'm here today because of New Frontiers. So we're going to dive back into that. But I'm so pleased on this part. And this is such a cool topic. So let's go for it. Yeah.
Let's go for it. And I just so I don't forget, in fact, somebody just texted me.
Oh, right.
I want to say that you can get, so if you listen to this podcast and you're inspired, which likely you will be, you can get these SPMs at 15% off. Just go over to our show notes page, or if you're on the newsletter, you'll see it come out in the newsletter as well. So there's a discount code that you can use. So listen, with that, for anybody who doesn't know what specialized pro-resolving lipid mediators are, just give me a little bit of a background on them.
Yeah. Well, and I say that like I'm here literally because of this, because so if we go back, gosh, for me, it was probably somewhere around 2000. I was, in this space, just really fascinated with research. And at the time, some of that was the newer research on fish oil and different fish oil products. And so for like about 5 years in there, I was looking at it, and, you had all of these different companies that were launching different products. But there was also this conversation, and, as you look into the research, where you would see like fish, fatty fish, yes, check the box always. Like things happened differently for people who were eating fish regularly. And then you would see sometimes as it related to the supplements, right? Sometimes. And there were these questions. And so it has taken us, I would say, that like these 2 decades, and thank you so much to the podcast with Dr. Charles Serhan. And that was it was like, all of these like crazy light bulbs went off for me, where I was like, thank you for this amazing work. Because what we learned is 2 really important things. What we learned is that fish, what you get when you eat a fish is not what's in most fish oil products. And then the second part is inflammation is not just about turning off inflammation. We have to resolve the inflammation. So, in terms of being here today and this conversation, the specialized pro-resolving mediators, they are different than, they're what happens to the EPA and the DHA and the DPA, and interestingly also the AA, so we don't want to, throw out our omega-6s there, when enzymes actually act on it. And it's kind of funny right now, because as I'm telling this to you, I feel like I'm here like trying to like defend my thesis to my teacher, because I was like, okay, I learned this, right? So suffice to say, if anyone wants to dig really deeply into this, Kara's previous podcast and also the Metagenics Institute has such fabulous information from the experts who have researched this and gone over that. What I wanted to do today is have a conversation about why do, as practitioners and individuals, why do we have to dive deeper into this? Because we can't take this previously understood as anti-inflammatory approach and just kind of check the box and walk away from a health standpoint. So that's what I wanted to say about it. Did I miss anything?
Well,
okay,
I'm just gonna circle back and put a couple of underlines and so forth. So first of all, Charles Serhan is the guy who actually discovered specialized pro-resolving lipid mediators. And these are like literally hundreds of molecules coming from omega-6s and omega-3s. So these are the derivative molecules that exist system-wide. There's compounds specific for the nervous system, for, specific immune cells, for, just across the physiology. We're making these guys all the time if we have that ability to, as Ashley alluded to. We can't get them in most fish oil products. We get them from whole fish, and we can also make them, but there's plenty of times when we're not. They're essential for inflammation resolution. So anyway, we will in the show notes put a link to that Charles Serhan podcast, so you can learn from the guy who discovered them. It was an extraordinary opportunity for me. I actually had been stalking him for some years to get him to come on the podcast. So I was really deeply grateful when he finally joined us.
Brilliant. Yeah.
Thanks. So show notes, connect to the Serhan podcast. We'll connect over to the Metagenics Institute because there is a wealth of information. It's not a bad idea to have a little bit of a background understanding of where they're coming from. But to Ashley's point, where she sits best is thinking about them, in clinical practice. So yeah, so with that in mind, take us where you want to go.
Yeah. And I will add on to it too. I was just like a couple days ago in preparation for this, listening to even more of the research. And it was about how our vagus nerve, when functioning properly, actually also produces these. So we start to understand, as we start to look at like how the whole body works together, why this is so important. And so the question that I've been trying to answer from a clinical standpoint is, when I work with, so first and foremost, if I'm putting someone on a fish oil as a supplement, an EPA and a DHA, there have always been conversations about is it just a higher dose, right? Like, so if somebody is not doing well, if somebody has rheumatoid arthritis, or if somebody literally if we're dealing with wound healing, or any of these examples of inflammation, is it just about a higher dose? And I think we got into this place where we were chasing higher doses. And for me, that didn't make sense, especially somebody who usually comes from a food first, standpoint. We also, of course, find ourselves in the situation today where people are not eating fish, or where they're certainly not able to, from an access standpoint, get in the quality of fish that they would need to consume at the frequency, on that part. And then I think the additional part of all of this is our genetics. So I'll pause for a second and say that for me, sometimes understanding how something works is if I look at how something else might work. So another area, when we look at methylation in the body and we're trying to understand, should somebody be getting their folate from food? Absolutely, right? And what happens if somebody goes to folic acid? It would have to go through more processes to actually break it down to be able to be absorbed, right?
That's a good analogy.
Your groups are totally following that along, or the listeners. And so when we come over here, what we're realizing is that it could seem very easy. Get enough EPA, DHA, DPA, another omega-3, make sure you get the right omega-6s in the right amounts. Get all of those in, and your body, using enzymes, will staple together and give you these pro-resolving mediators. But that isn't happening for a lot of people. And I'm seeing one of the most exciting discoveries of using these in the supplemental form is seeing solutions for people that prior to that, there wasn't anything that was getting them over the finish line. We weren't seeing the impact of resolution. So bringing it back to Charles, also, one of the things that he said, when you did his podcast, it wasn't like these were super available. Now, thanks to places like Metagenics, we can get these in a supplement form. And what he said is even in this short amount of time period, there's been so much more research that's been able to be done in humans with this application. I thought I think that's so exciting for us to talk about, because when you go into the body and the body experiences inflammation, if we do not actively work on, and the body has to have the right equipment to do that resolution. So if it doesn't say to the army that's there, stop, we are done with you. We want to lipid switch now, and we don't want any more attack to happen. We want to come in and clean up the mess. And we want to make sure that in cleaning up the mess, we now start the repair work process. Then that is where that missing link is, where we're seeing people not get better, from the results of inflammation. So
let me underline two things. Hold on to that thought. First of all, folks, we'll link to that vagus nerve paper that Ashley just mentioned. I want to see it. And I think you're saying in a variety of ways that many of us don't effectively make it. So we may be giving people grams of fish oil per day and not seeing the inflammation turnaround that we're anticipating. So for some reason, people aren't taking that EPA DHA substrate and converting, or they're consuming fish and they're not having the same kind of outcome that we're anticipating. Maybe this is the quality of fish. I mean, that could be myriad reasons. But the reality is that some of us, especially those of us, I think, with underlying inflammatory bias, don't effectively convert. So there's evidence in the literature that some of us just don't effectively make these. And I think the inflammatory piece is part of that story. And so we have to kind of jump it. And as you pointed out, we can provide those substrates. We can provide the SPMs themselves, not the substrates, the molecules themselves.
Right.
And I do want to point out, so we don't forget, the way that Metagenics is producing it is the patented Serhan method. So they're making their SPMs in the same as Serhan is making them in the research setting where he's using them, which I think is cool. And they've shown just ready absorption. They've shown impressive human data on that as well. And the other thing that I want to point out on why some of us aren't making them. So there's a conversion issue. There's potentially a genetic conversion issue, potentially an inflammatory driven inhibition of conversion. But the other thing is, and you probably are going to say this, so you can repeat it again later. If we're taking some of these anti-inflammatories, if we're taking non-steroidal anti-inflammatories, we're shutting down that conversion. It's extraordinary. And this is really game changing, I think, for a lot of us. If our patients are on non-steroidal anti-inflammatories, even an aspirin, a full dose aspirin, very low dose aspirin actually can potentially have a favorable effect on SPMs. But if you're taking like a 300+ milligram dose of aspirin, you're shutting down the conversion, you're shutting down those enzymes. And you can shut down the inhibition. You alluded to earlier that we actually need some arachidonic acid. So that the classic pro-inflammatory omega-6, you guys, will produce the resolvin lipoxin, and that starts the party. So from inflammation happens inflammation resolution. So we do need some background there. I've yet to see in my practice and in my, when I was in the laboratory, I don't know that I've ever in my entire career seen somebody without arachidonic acid. So we really all have it, unless we're just completely shutting down the pathway and the class switch journey with, non-steroidal anti-inflammatories. So for a variety of reasons, we're not getting it via a number of different mechanisms. And that means we're not cleaning up inflammation. And to your point, there's a place for these in practice. Okay, back to you.
Yeah. Well, and I mean, I love it. It's like, I'm like, yeah. And then, so if we look at, the travesty or the learning experience, unfortunately for some, we learned from their health issues, but of COX-2 inhibitors. I think that's so important for us to understand. And I remember one time when Andy Weil was launching his book, it said, and it was the anti-inflammatory diet, he was like coming out, et cetera. And I looked at him and I was like, Andy, I was like, it's not really anti-inflammatory. It's like the chronic, inappropriate, whatever. And he's like, I thought you were in marketing, Koff. I was like, noted. All right. So, but we've put so much emphasis on this idea of anti-inflammation. I'm so glad that you brought it up, because we ditched COX-2 inhibitors for the most part and said, okay, that's a problem. We don't want to turn this off. And yet, many patients are coming in, many practitioners are trying to stop all inflammation across the board, including attacking things like seed oils and saying like, have no seed oils, right? Which I think is like one of the dumbest statements, like blanket statements. If you want to talk about industrial seed oils and get into processing, and I'd prefer you actually said, just watch out for vegetable oils and, look at this. But,
Right.
When we look at this and we say like, we need to be all this way and not this way, I think that's so smart. So when we are as individuals trying to either optimize our health or improve our health to get to the place where we can be in an optimizing state, we have to recognize that part of that is nurturing both of these phases of inflammation. So I think for you and I, we could probably give people another way of thinking about it, which is, remember, our detoxification system. We talk about it as having two, some people talk about the third, it gets too confusing for me, two phases of detoxification, right? Where we need both of those to be working at the same degree of efficiency so that the whole resulting process actually translates into hormones that are used coming through, or toxins that are presented coming through, getting converted, and then getting eliminated. So if we bring that into what would the SPMs, the reason that, like, I will tell you, SPMs have become, and I'm saying I will tell you, the listeners, not you, Kara, but I will tell you that SPMs are a foundational part of anybody's supplemental plan, because I actually can find a way typically for you to get most nutrients in, probably not vitamin D, and maybe not CoQ10, but I am typically doing SPMs for almost everyone, because number one, I may not have your genetic information and I may not know, are there inefficiencies in like 10 of these different, from the FADS genes to the OX gene, like all of these, like, are there inefficiencies? I'm not going to necessarily know that. Are you somebody who trends towards, more inflammation? Like, I may not know that. And if I don't have that information, if I'm coming in with an SPM to make things easier on your system to turn off inflammation, to do the resolution work, like, that's such a win. And we can't do that. Yes, we can eat fish, but even in eating fish, I haven't found anyone where I'm trying to address the resolving and their overall inflammatory condition where I've just been able to say eat fish. When I add in the SPMs, the results go off the charts. Are you seeing the same thing?
That's interesting. What do I want to say about it? SPMs are a part of my, foundational stack. I'm extremely bullish on getting that information. I think of nutrients in food as information. So I want the information of SPMs in my body.
Right.
Like I am bullish on them, and I eat fish and I take fish oil. So the whole complement of, of the polyunsaturated fatty acid journey, I want in sufficient amounts. And I'll just throw in the fact that, we evolved with about a 1-to-1 omega-6 to 3 intake in our diet. And currently in some settings, it's about a 25-to-1, 6 to 3. So this is a really sort of gross modern life experiment of profound deficiency in this information that our bodies evolved with. Like, this is information that we really need. And so for that reason, I take SPMs in my practice, in my own stack. I prescribe them a lot to my patients. I don't know that I'm quite as foundational in that I don't know that I'm bringing them in as often as, you're articulating where you're initiating them as you would vitamin D. although there is, I use them very, very, very frequently. I guess for one of the things that I would love to see is a lab, I mean, and they're pretty volatile, but, could we actually measure and identify who's making sufficient amounts of SPMs? I mean, if you hit the omega-3 index, the Harris omega-3 index, where, 8+% of your red blood cell membrane is comprised of omega-3 fatty acids, and you're healthy, are you taking that information and converting it to resolvins? I mean, I'm looking forward to that granular piece, because I don't know that those of us really focusing on optimal health need to be using SPMs all of the time, but, just the underlying inflammation is a thing in this modern world, and ensuring, and the little extra insurance of SPMs for me has been important. And I know after listening to this podcast, if some of my patients are listening to this podcast, they're like, why didn't you start me on SPMs? I've started plenty of folks on SPMs.
And I think, we're having such a classic doctor dietitian conversation. So here's the reason why. Well, I think on that part, because so absolutely, I want to continue to get the data. And I think what you're expressing there, that makes a ton of sense on that piece. Plus, let's also just have the real conversation about cost, right? So we have to look strategically at what people can afford. Right. The challenge that I have is neither of us ever are going to prescribe for someone a perfect diet. But even in those better choices, the ability to get in what you need on a daily basis in those better choices. So a lot of my clients travel, a lot of them, are like, oh, I'm driving the kids to, 4 different things, and fast food is happening and all of this stuff. Yeah. And so for me, the reason that it's become foundational is actually for that reason. Now, what I'll tell you is, or we're a little bit different, I'm actually not as often, I don't as often turn to fish oil. Fish oil is a significant part of a lot of different recommendations. And a good quality fish oil, I like game on, I love I'm a huge wild Alaskan salmon girl from going up and, seeing how just what those fish have in them. It's like amazing on that part. So I love that piece. But I also can see, and I do look at blood work and can see where people are making choices where they're getting in the different fatty acids, and may also be doing well in their diet. And we're doing pretty well there. But the SPM for me is that's why I talk about it like vitamin D. It really is very foundational for me. So I was just actually working with a couple on fertility, and I'm not their primary dietitian. I was actually helping to support. And we were going through some things, it's so hard with the fertility story to be like, and now they're pregnant. Look, everyone, this has been years in the making. I am very excited that they are pregnant. I also am not going to say that the only thing that switched things on was the SPM, but I will say that I do think adding that in there helped someone whose body, with the EPA and the DHA and some of the other pieces, things were just they weren't resolving. She had a variety of different, she had an autoimmune disease, she had other stuff going on. Yeah. And so, to me, it has really become more foundational in that part, because I see diets that are that are really human on a regular basis. You know what I mean?
That is fair. And we use SPMs routinely in hormone imbalances. We know that there's an identified SPM imbalance in endometriosis, for example, one of the classic causes of infertility, among other things. So that's an awesome indication. That would be an important reason to be prescribing them. Yeah, I agree with you. It's funny. I don't exactly want to debate with you, but I do.
Hey, why not?
I agree with you. So that SPM information is essential. However, it's not going to be populating the lipid membrane as the polyunsaturated substrates. Right. So in my opinion, you have to have both. And again, in active inflammatory conditions, I don't know, I'm scanning my patient charts in my current patient population, and really most, if not all of them, are taking SPMs because they're in active current care with me. But I absolutely, I see the lipid membrane. We need to have those. I have to believe that, when we get them to the other side of that inflammation dominant journey that they're going to be able to make them, but we won't have that information really until we can measure, and they're not ready for prime time. I know on my podcast with Serhan, he thought that they had him available at Wayne State University, and believe me, we chased it down, and they're not yet.
They're not yet.
So they're only in the research setting.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think I think we're both right in here. Oh, and the other piece that I wanted to add regarding fish, even people in my practice who are savvy consumers of fish and making appropriate selection choices, I'm seeing more and more mercury. And it's anecdotal, this is from my practice, but I would say out of my last maybe 6 patients that I can think of, I just presented this too. I presented this in the immune module at IFM because I lecture on fatty acids and cover resolvents there. And I just presented this, this little case series because it's really alarming to me. It's very concerning as somebody who's been practicing in this space for many, many, many years. We always look for mercury, but I'm seeing it more frequently in people who know how to select fish. And it's depressing. So, there's just another reason to think about having, clean source fish oil, but also SPMs.
Yeah. And I think that's it. I mean, I think it's the, and look, I love quality fish oils as a resource. So there's no argument in that conversation. I've had conversations with vegan clients, or what I'll say plant-based, they're not plant monogamous. I've had people who just say, I just don't tolerate fish oil. We've even tried krill oil, whatever.
Yeah.
But for some reason, the SPM is just totally fine. So I'll get in there. Like I literally the other day, I had somebody who's on an omega-3, 6, and 9 from 3, 6, 7, 9 from plants. And then we're adding the SPM, and that seems to be like this really nice, collaboration. Now, of course, you have to be able to convert your 3, 6, 7, and 9, and make sure on that part. So I would not.
And you're not going to be. You're not going to be converting. Let's just the reality is that you're not going to be converting plant-based. We could explore algae a little bit more, but if you're doing plants, and you're willing to take SPMs, then that's I think the lift. I feel like that may be the space where, again, so, in the space of truly personalized. So look, guys, we can do a lot of this from a very data-driven way. We've mentioned genetics. I think there's a lot of value in looking at that. I think you can look at, I wouldn't just look at arbitrarily one essential fatty acid panel, but we could look at a couple and start to see, what, I love to use data to judge the ROI of your decisions. But I also think when we look at supplements, some things are, it's rare that I come in and I'm like, oh, definitely on this as a supplement. And I think that is one of the places for this. I love what you said about aspirin too, because I think that's actually one that, as we look at not just the tools for reducing inflammation, I mean, I'm seeing people come in on like 6 different types of anti-inflammatory herbs and all of this other stuff. So I think that really actually deserves more attention, which is the easy way for you to think about it is, if you know that both of these processes need to be happening at an equal or the same degree of efficiency, and you're investing all of your nutrition and your supplemental nutrition, which is targeted, nutrients, hopefully high quality, on that part, and you're doing it on that side, and you don't have the resolving part in there, there's just this big gap. And I think that, whether it's as a practitioner or somebody listening, if your practitioner has you following everything from an anti-inflammatory approach, and you don't have the resolving component to it, that is, and especially if you're somebody who is on that because you're trying to, as you said, like an active patient, you're trying to actively address something that is, an inflammatory response, you do want to make sure that you're doing the resolution phase as well. Yeah. It was a nice, I think your detox analogy was nice. So you want phase 1 and 2 kick in.
Right.
And that's what we're looking at here. So there's inflammation, there's anti-inflammation. So there's turning the volume down on the generation of inflammation. So that's cleaning up the diet, that's exercising, getting enough sleep, taking care of your gut, using some curcumin, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So that's the front end of inflammation. The extraordinary thing that Serhan put on the map with that specialized pro-resolving lipid mediators is that white blood cells themselves are pushing out inflammatory compounds. We all know that during the acute inflammatory response, which kicks into chronic for many of us. Actually, in the aging phenomena, there's the inflammation going on. So arguably, it's a course of aging that we want to really be paying attention to. So inflammation is happening. We can attack it at the front end. We're very good at that in functional medicine. What we're starting to get better at, but I think it's not fully appreciated, is this inflammation resolution, like the phase 2 detox, if you will. So that is that within those very same white blood cells, lipoxin is released from arachidonic acid. This is the resolvin coming from arachidonic acid, and that lipoxin initiates a class switch of the behavior of the cell to start pumping out resolvins. And these guys go in and literally, start dumping out molecules and attracting the cleanup crew, the macrophages to start eating the debris up, and et cetera, et cetera. And there's this whole incredible class switch journey to clean up and to repair and to turn the volume down. And it's extraordinary.
And to have a different type of macrophage, right? Like,
yes,
so
yes,
like,
yes,
it, I think it's like, what is that expression there? Like, for every action, there's an equal and opposite. Like, we just can't say that, hey, we want to just push on one level. So glad you brought up sleep, because one of the other areas that I was looking at, and I think this is more new science, so stay tuned and let's dive into the research, and keep looking at it. But they're actually looking at a circadian rhythm production component to your resolvent. So what Kara was just talking about,
makes total sense.
And it was basically saying in people with heart disease. So that's like i.e. almost, the millions and millions of people on that part. There is a lesser production. And then if you look at, okay, so if I'm on a statin drug, and what is the statin medication, there are so many pieces to this for us to look at, where I think, to me, what has felt like a very simple starting point is to make sure that I'm getting in at least a couple times a week if I'm in good health and looking to stay that way. I'm nurturing the resolvin phase, so nurturing that, we'll call it phase 2 now, we're at that resolvin phase on that piece. And if I'm somebody who is trying to, as you said, more of an active patient, if I'm trying to actually help my system, especially in autoimmune, turn around and not attack itself, you need to arm the resolvin so that the messages can go in and say, hey, the art to the warriors that came in. I was describing it to somebody the other day, saying, imagine if tomorrow, one can hope this, that the war in the Ukraine is over, but if nobody actually told the people fighting there that the war was over, and nobody got the message, and we're all celebrating that the war is over, people would still be fighting, and there would still be death, and there would still be, and also nobody would be rebuilding there, and all of this stuff, and all the damage, right? And so we need all of that to come in, and I think that that's the, it's such a key place. The other place that I'm really excited about is in performance athletes. So let's move actually to a different area where when we think about the amount of stress that we are intentionally incurring. I'm a huge NBA fan. I've had 2 sleepless nights with, last night's games were blowouts, but the night before, my Cavs and the Magic were down to the minute, with a single shot. So I think my stress needed it. Imagine what the actual players, their bodies. And so when we look at this and we say, hey, how do we make sure that your body can interpret the messaging of, I am going to go in and do all of this intense stress work for you in this time period, and then how am I going to turn the stress off? So of course we look at things like magnesium, and we look at, the benefits of cold and hot and all of these other things. Well, now throw into there an injury, right? So throw into that system an injury. If we don't have the ability for resolution to occur, or just a slight injury, we can see where something, and what we see a lot of times with athletes is that an injury just kind of is sticking around. It's literally not getting better, so to me, that's been just such an exciting area. I've talked to a number of different sports performance, both the dietitians and also the physicians around it, and just saying, hey, look at your protocol differently, especially in season, for someone in terms of what they're getting in.
Yes. And another arm we could go down in that direction. So athletics at the pro level or at the competitive level. I frequently bring up myself as a former, low level competitive cyclist,
Yeah.
and I would get sinusitis at the end of every season. So I was pushing and pushing and pushing and pushing and moving into like a chronically inflamed place. So SPMs would have been entirely appropriate, but that was before they were available. So to help with the cleanup, some of that. So what's interesting is that these are about inflammation resolution, but they're not immune suppressive.
Right.
This is not an NSAID. This is not a biologic. This is not shutting down the immune system. It's balancing it and it's supporting it. So even in active, in an appropriate immune activation case, you can still use these. They're not contraindicated. If anything, some of our go-to medications, again, thinking about NSAIDs, et cetera, will shut down the inflammation resolution journey, will shut down that balancing phenomena. So I do think athletics is a great place to be considering them. In fact, I presented a case series. We used them in practice. We use them in practice all the time, but we did a very intentional data dive into our cases in 2019 and 2020, and then I presented those data in Australia. Actually, it was quite fun. And one of the anecdotal cases just was from a team member who was skiing and using SPMs acutely. So this is another. We're gonna listen. Put a pin in it. After I make this statement, I want you to circle back and start talking about how you're using them, how you're dosing them beyond just part of your foundational stack. Let's talk about indications. Let's talk about dosing, chronic, acute. So one of the really amazing things is that you can't take 2 fish oil and say, call me in the morning. You will not get acute relief for fish oil. So fish oil, you're changing the guards in the lipid membrane, and that's going to take, 3+ months or more, thinking just about the lifespan of a red blood cell. So it's not something you can use acutely, but you can absolutely use SPMs acutely. And that's one of the really exciting things that we've seen, and the evidence corroborates that they're absorbed and they can identify them in circulation, I think within 15 minutes. It's awesome. So we can absolutely use these acutely. So with that piece, and so she was using them acutely post skiing, instead of popping a couple of Advil, she was able to pop a couple of SPMs. Let's talk about how you're using them, what indications beyond the healthy stack, and how you're dosing them in variety, in a variety of indications.
Yeah, and part of this is also too the work that whether it's my patient or it's in collaboration with a practitioner who's sending a patient over, and then as I've been talking to different practitioners about their stacks and their different patient, what they're doing there. So one of the really, we'd have to be living under a rock right now for nobody to be thinking or talking about Ozempic. So let's just start right in there.
Right.
So, when we look at your incretin hormones, of course, we're having a conversation about the lining of your digestive tract around the mucosal layer. So there are so many factors that impact inflammation, and so many ways that inflammation can go awry in the mucosal layer there. So that is personal to me. That started me on my journey, and that is certainly has been the bulk of my work. So I would definitely say and perhaps actually that's part of the reason that it's more foundational for me. It could be that conversation, because I do believe that part of our foundational work right now has to be to do everything that we can to support that healthy mucosal layer, right? To have the inflammation response occur appropriately there. So why did I go immediately to Ozempic? Well, one of the things that we're seeing with individuals is, first of all, just a decrease in intake, and in some instances, a very marked reduction in intake. That concerns me a lot about their inflammatory status. I will also tell you that the SPMs, so I do use Metagenics SPM Active, and it's actually small. It's not one of those huge. So I do have some people too that I have them put a pin in it, and they squeeze it in, or to their beverage, or just directly into their mouth. So if they just don't want to swallow the capsule, but I find it really like that size easy. Works very well.
And there's no fish burps or fish stomach ache.
Yes, that's right. Yeah. So, whether it's the burping or just, the size of something. So one of the things that I want for anyone who is deciding to go on that journey and to use that as a tool to help with their, whether it's food noise, guilt, or whether it's to stimulate incretin hormone for metabolic health, or whether it's the whole picture on that part. We know that both the two actual indications, approved indications for the medication are obesity and diabetes. And in both of those places, we need to make sure that we're addressing the root cause of inflammation. And so that's actually been a really useful spot for me. And one of the things that we've had people talk about is including that in there is, as you mentioned with your skier, but how like this side benefit that it's just been the combination of doing because there is potentially an anti-inflammatory component to the GLP-1 agonist, to semaglutide and tirzepatide, but this now adding the resolving, to me feels has been a really nice collaboration. Go ahead.
And there's evidence out there showing that those on the metabolic continuum, specifically they looked at metabolic syndrome, they were not making sufficient SPMs. Right. So there's, so your suspicion, your hunch, is correct in that.
Yeah. And we already are talking about too, we're addressing so many factors there with digestion and with your, stomach acid and, so many other pieces. So when we asked about like different places for me, that is typically, I'm trying to get them to get 2 capsules in a day. If I can get 1 in, I'm actually happy. If somebody is on an autoimmune disease, I've been doing 2 and 2, has an active autoimmune disease, and we're trying to reduce symptoms. So if their symptoms, they're symptomatic and we're working on that process, then I'm typically doing 2 twice a day. So I go to a higher amount. That also, though, does depend on what else they're able to get in. So if somebody, I may just be keeping them at 1 or 2 because I don't want to overwhelm a system, and just start to kind of see, at an individual level, how does our whole approach, whether I've, removed gluten, whether I've got you, I've got you on gut healing stuff, we're doing all this other stuff, how responsive are you? But a lot of times we'll actually start off at that higher amount of the 2 and 2. Is that where you've been tracking with things like rheumatoid arthritis and psoriatic arthritis? And
so for auto, I think 2 and 2 is entirely reasonable. I use and they're the toxicity studies, they're just really safe. They're well tolerated. You're not going to be limited by stomach aches or et cetera. Right. So I will go higher, especially for acute indications. So a really interesting case was an HLA-B27 uveitis patient that I worked with, and she had a prodrome experience where it would feel like she had dust in her eyes, and here's another amazing indication, she would have post-steroid rebound flares, as we see in skin and, all the time. And so I would have her at the first sign dose a couple of SPMs, like every 2 to 3 hours at that prodrome, and we effectively shut it off. We shut that prodrome off, and she didn't move into it. I've used it for the in a few different cases for steroid rebound effect. So I'm not, it's not a cheap product, but I am not
right. Yeah.
That's a potential rate limiter. But if people can invest maybe a bottle or so, maybe 2 bottles, and use it acutely, we can really shut things down. And then I would say that 2 twice a day or 2 once a day. So 2 twice a day in early treatment, and then maybe, just BID after that long term would be my approach in autoimmunity. And with, again, in certain instances, just using, just turning the volume up for that first sign. There's another patient I'm thinking of right now who we've shut down chronic sinusitis in her, many, many years, and SPMs has been a piece of that journey along with some other,
Yeah, and part of it is, and I know like we love Himalayan tartary buckwheat, and so like part of it is the polyphenol, like the other conversation. So, one of the things I think we're always evaluating with our patient care is, we look at their total nutrition, and so of course here when we're talking about the dosage, we're talking about it just as it relates to the SPM, but part of that's going to be impacted. If I can get somebody on, like I use Microbiome Rejuvenate. I love that product with the Himalayan tartary buckwheat in it. If I can use that and the SPM for some of these patients, I'm going to be in a better spot for them overall. But if I can't, that might be where I'm at, and so it kind of depends on, what we can do in that space. I did mention fertility. I really like it. I've been talking to individuals. I've just been doing one, so I'm not having a pregnant woman so infertility is a different story. That's a conversation about what's the root cause of the infertility, what are we looking at, et cetera, on that part. But in collaboration with a prenatal, like I love it and I think we do have to be careful about the buyer beware. I love that you have the intricacy and we're able to communicate about the fact that the way Metagenics is making their product is the way that Serhan has established. With the popularity of SPMs, which is also, sometimes you'll just see PRM on there. We're kind of seeing it like pop up on a lot of fish oil products. And that's a little bit concerning to me too for, is it something that somebody added back in? Did they add a little back in? Are you going to get the efficacy? So, buyer beware and look at the product. But I think just one of the really good quality in collaboration with your fish oil, or I have some women who do not want the fish oil, but they'll take the SPM. So I don't know on that part.
And there's a hint. There's EPA and DHA are in the SPMs, just at lower quantities.
At a lower quantity on that part. So, to me, I think that piece is significant. Okay, so the other one that I think is totally worth the conversation. Well, there are two. I think the heart health side, and then I think we really have to talk about this perimenopause, menopause piece in there. I think on the heart health for me, so there's two things. If I have genetics and I'm able to see, especially with somebody's ApoE status, that's going to help me really figure out if I want to hit it a little bit harder or sort of what we're looking at. And then also their LP little a, et cetera. So I think there's definitely indication there. And then on the... Yeah. And even 3-4, but I just to make sure that we're getting, and again, that genetic part, we're not missing something. Perimenopause, I'm fascinated. I'm in it. So there's that conversation, and so I have been adding it to most of my perimenopausal women's stack in terms of, so I also really love to hit gamma-linoleic fatty acid, at a good amount. And have been adding that in. Again, typically it's 1 to 2 a day. And so, if I can get somebody to have 2 a day, especially if they're having hot flashes, if they're having skin issues, if they're having dryness, especially the dry eye. There's also some really good research with SPMs around glaucoma and other things. So especially if you're worried about that piece, it's an area to look at. But I would say that's another one that I'm really focused on too.
That's awesome. That's awesome. That's really interesting. Gamma-linoleic acid, that is an omega-6, you guys, that converts to dihomogamma-linoleic, and it is converted to DGLA. Has a handful of really beautiful anti-inflammatory and coursinoids it's converted to. I actually am pretty bullish on the idea that GLA to DGLA, probably DGLA has a host of resolvins yet to be discovered.
Yes.
And yes. I was talking to Serhan about that. If I had a different career, I would probably, I would want to be a lipidologist, at least in part. I mean, I'd probably want to do epigenetics as well, but it's funny. I'm pretty sure those have yet to be discovered. And he said that he thought so as well. Just structurally, DGLA makes sense. Yes. That it would be able to, and the fact that it's already, known to be able to make anti-inflammatory and coursinoids. So that's why we're using the DGL, the GLA. The GLA, right. From evening primrose or from borage oil, you guys.
Or I use hemp seed and hemp seed oil, just depending on the quality and what you're able to get in. But I call it the glamour fatty acid. Like we got to get enough of that in. And I'm with you on the DGLA.
And we'll see deficiency. A lot of people don't have enough. Always take that with some EPA and DHA, and probably the SPM, the EPA DHA. It doesn't take a lot. The EPA and DHA, even in SPMs, is sufficient. Otherwise, it can be converted to arachidonic acid. So yeah, thanks for bringing GLA into the picture. It's a molecule who has yet to have its moment in the sun, but it's got a nice long traditional use history, especially in naturopathic medicine, and there's important reasons to be believing in it. Those are awesome indications. So for me, we're using SPMs. We had a fun case using it acutely in a thumb tendonitis case, and this woman found it to be as effective as ibuprofen when she had flares. I've used it, I've used it in neurodegenerative conditions. I think your ApoE4 point is brilliant. I've used it in Parkinson disease, again, uveitis and other eye conditions. I've used it in an allergic disease. There's some nice evidence in animal models around having a balancing and inhibitory effect on IgE. So an acute urticaria case, or excuse me, a chronic urticaria case comes to mind. Certainly autoimmunity across the board, pain, I think, of any flavor. We've used it in headaches. There is, I will say, I used it aggressively in a plantar fasciitis case, which, and it didn't have a big impact. However, she was able to do the Graston technique. She went to a chiropractor, and, I refer for that routinely for plantar fasciitis, and you can just kind of kick it out. You can just resolve it. So yeah, what else would I say? I think,
what about you've mentioned a couple of the, from a bacteria and virus, but I actually haven't seen that many long COVID patients, but part of that is this long COVID bucket of definition. So, we'll talk about it and say this is probably long COVID, but that's not specific to the work that we're doing. And yet I've had repeat conversations about, and actually with somebody with EBV where it was I would recommend this, here's what I would recommend. And I've had people go off and talk about it and perhaps pursue that with their practitioner. Is that something that you have any more experience in with either with patients or what you're seeing?
So just to bring back to my earlier point, we don't want to be afraid of SPMs when we're looking at some sort of an immune-driven problem. An immune, like there's a cool Lyme arthritis paper. Again, it's in an animal model, but it's still really compelling. They published looking at using SPMs in COVID, and there's certainly I've used SPMs routinely in my patients where I suspect EBV or some other sort of a chronic infection as a piece of the puzzle. So yeah, without question, I think it has a role, and we don't want to mistakenly look at inflammation resolution as immune inhibition in a way that would allow the condition to flourish. In cancer, it's not contraindicated for me in cancer, and I'm sure, and I'll just pin it to the show notes again, along with the Serhan podcast. Actually,
well, in the Serhan, right?
We've discussed cancer using it.
And is it his student or his colleague who
that's right.
That stuff is blowing me away. I mean, when you look at the ability to, with breast cancer cells and some of that, so that one was, so I'll tell you what else is in that podcast. I think I've listened to that like 6 times. That awesome. Part is so powerful. Let's talk for a second also about kids, because I think that's an interesting area where when we talk about this as being sort of, we've given the analogy of phase 1, phase 2, I in particular end up typically seeing children either for very, what one might say, quote unquote, weird allergies or intolerances, or where somebody is not there are limitations to their diet based on, diagnosis or, other pieces on that. And one of the things that I find that I very much appreciate, and I've been really comfortable at using it in children, is that the idea of I'm trying to do as much as possible to support a system working the way that it's supposed to work as easily as possible from the early days. So I'm using it in children, and in pediatric care. I had a kid who, oh my gosh, the histamine response was just off the charts, and I felt so bad. They were on a low histamine diet. by the way, for like 3 years.
Mm,
It was just so much food
mm,
avoidance, and then it was just let's keep taking away more and more foods on that part.
mm,
And they were on antihistamines,
mm.
just going about it, in my opinion, just really the wrong
Sure.
way.
Yeah.
So we've been able to really improve what they're able to, the diversity of the diet, and as a result, what they're able to tolerate. So
Sure.
I'm a really big fan there. I
Yeah.
would not say it's foundational there. I just want to be clear. I'm not coming in saying every child needs to be on this, but I do think that we can look at the benefits there for especially children where it may be that that system is showing that one side is over operating, the other is less efficient. Yeah.
Well, there's really cool data going back to fish oil as having an immune balancing and immune maturation effect in kids, and not a lot. So the immune system is really being developed, especially in infancy. And a piece of that is allowing sort of the Th1 arm. I know this is an oversimplification, but the Th1 arm to sort of be developed and then it can turn the volume down on Th2, which is the classic allergy arm. And there are some data really showing that happening with fish oil. I wouldn't be surprised if we saw the same thing, obviously, with SPMs, or that, maybe in some of the mechanism, has to do with the SPM production. So for sure, there's a piece. And the other obvious piece is, it can be difficult getting fish into our kids. My daughter takes an EPA DHA supplement, that I can get her, when I can get it in her.
Right.
So it's probably they're deficient, there a lot of them, because it's just, it can be challenging to get in. And again, it can be challenging to find really good quality sources of fish. And the other piece, Ashley, is like, we're seeing plenty of kids these days marching towards the chronic diseases of adulthood way earlier. Like, we're seeing metabolic disease. So those conditions that seem to have built into them an inability to make the resolvins, those guys are, those are happening in our children, at younger and younger ages. There's a handful of reasons to use them. And I certainly don't shy away from using them in my peds population.
I think it's so key on that part to basically say, we're you much more so than I, but that's one of the reasons I stay in your orbit, are so evidence-based. I'm extremely practice-based, and then I look at with the individual, and there in terms of using this, I think, and again, when I talk about this is really using it. It really is the supplement. This isn't, this is saying, hey, I'm going to see what I can do for you right now by adding this in, as we said, increasing the dose. But it will be really fascinating to just keep following the research, and now that the SPMs are available, just to see, does it help women who struggle with breastfeeding? Does it improve early gut development? I mean, there are just so many pieces.
Yes.
Concussion, somebody was asking me about with concussion, I was like, I mean, it's just fascinating to me. So,
well, listen, let me go back to concussion, and we're at time, but let me just go back to that, because there are, reports in the literature of using massive amounts of EPA and DHA. We know DHA is, the main omega-3 in the lipid membrane in the central nervous system. And then we retroconvert it to EPA, but then we go on to make resolvins. But what about those cases when we're not? Anyway, using these mega amounts of fish oil in traumatic brain injury, it has to be that the mechanism is that you're pushing the neuroprotectants, that you're pushing that class of resolvins that specifically exist in the brain that are produced from DHA. I mean, that just has to be, in my mind, what's happening here. And Serhan could speak to that. And maybe there's evidence in a mouse model or something. But no doubt we want to be thinking about these plus, and I would argue plus high dose fish oil in brain injury for sure.
Yeah, and especially that's a population that's going to be taking so many of those, very likely those anti-inflammatories at high doses.
Yeah, so that's right.
I could talk to you about it forever. I love it. I love it. Yeah.
Listen, totally. You guys, I want to hear from you on this one. I don't usually put that out there, but I would be really curious to hear from the clinicians. You can post your comments on iTunes, or you can just email us. I think you can make a comment on the transcript page if you go over to our show notes. We'll populate our show notes with as much as we can, because there's so much out there. Go to the Serhan podcast if you haven't had a listen. It's one of my favorite all-time podcasts ever. Thank you, Dr. Serhan, for joining me. And yeah, we'll come back. We'll circle back maybe in a year or so, Ashley, and continue the conversation. Thanks for joining me.
Thanks for having me.